what is going on here? Okay, it don't make sense. Okay, because people that got alcohol problems, they also like cocaine. People that get cocaine are like even heroin. People that use drugs seem to want to. They have. If their father was an alcoholic and they're a child of an alcoholic, they don't want to become like their dad, but they get heavy. They're linked to some substances that are going to make them feel good. Okay, so the idea was when I was thinking about it was reward. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Wellness at the Speed of Light show. I'm your friendly spine surgeon host, Dr. Stefano Sinacropi, where we go down the rabbit hole of everything wellness. In today's episode number 6, we are beyond privileged to welcome the distinguished Dr. Kenneth Blum, who, for those of you that don't know, is one of the most famous and highly decorated pharmacologists in the United States and has been doing this for decades, dating back to 1961 when he got his bachelor's degree at Columbia University, my alma mater. Dr. Blum then got his PhD in 1968 at the New York Medical College, and since that time has been nothing shy of a pioneer in the field of neuropsychopharmacology and genetics. His first massive discovery and breakthrough, which he's very well known for, is discovering the allele of the D2 receptor of dopamine, which if you have that allele, you express these D2 receptors at a decreased rate in the brain's pleasure reward center. And this leads to people potentially becoming alcoholics, and they showed that clearly on studies of the human brain. Now, over his career of work, he spent, and I don't say this lightly, almost every waking hour thinking about how does addiction work and how can we try to fight back against this horrible crisis. And over time, he came up with an epiphany which has absolutely changed the way we think about addiction. What he came up with was the fact that addictions are associated with decreased dopaminergic response. In other words, dopamine is either secreted less or absorbed less, and therefore you need more of a stimulation to get that happiness, that joy, the pleasure that comes from those receptors being stimulated. And therefore, if there's a decreased dopamine, you can't stimulate and you tend to become addicted. And this was titled the reward deficiency syndrome, which he first coined in 1995, but was accepted globally in 1996 when published in a major journal. After that time, he continued to study the genetics of addiction and figured out that there were multiple alleles that if you had a certain number of them, you were much more likely to become addicted depending on how many of those alleles we had. And he came up with something called the GARS test, the Genetic Addiction Risk Score, a test that can actually look at your genetics and tell you whether or not you're more likely to get addicted. Now, what does this do? This gives us potentially a predictive power in order to determine who is more at risk for potentially becoming addicted. As a physician, this would be a tool that I could use before utilizing certain tools to treat patients and being very, very careful about getting people down the road of addiction. And obviously, we deal a lot with opioid addiction. It's a horrible crisis. It's worldwide. It is nothing short of a disaster. And anything that we can do to circumvent that, improve it, and then come up with true actionable ideas to make it better. And Dr. Blum is absolutely brilliant in this area. And we discuss it for quite a long time on today's podcast. We also go into other addictions, okay? And so we talk about things like food addiction, we talk about GLP-1s, and the possible effect of GLP-1s directly on the pleasure reward center and some potential downsides of that. We talk about other addictions and how they all correlate, and they're all related to the way that your brain is processing dopamine. Again, one of the things all roads lead to dopamine. Okay, this is something that Dr. Blum talks about quite a bit. So please, I urge you to watch the entirety of the show. The wealth of information that he has amassed over his decades in these fields it's mind blowing. And so I hope you enjoy today's show and keep tuning in for episodes of Wellness at the Speed of Light. And on that note, let's get started.
We just did a paper that we submitted to, I forgot where we submitted it, but I know, to the archives, active scientific neurology. And it talks about a patient that used it and ended up with hemiplegic migraines to the point where he almost died.
Oh, man.
So
we'll get into that. I'm going to ask you some stuff because I want to tie the reward deficiency syndrome into overeating and how it ties into our obesity crisis.
It's substance and behavioral addiction, all of it.
It's all the same. I know. I see some of your charts. I meant to have my book. I have your book on the 12 steps and how I actually read through a lot of it. It's great because it's nice and short, so I can digest, my orthopedic mind can digest some of these concepts in little bits. And
yes.
And that note, let's get started. This is great. This is going to be awesome. So the first thing so thanks for being on the show today. I'm honored really that you're on the show. The work that you've done in this field is like, I ask our audience to go and just look up your resume online and they will be blown away as to how much you've done in this field. But what I'd really like to ask you is, what got you into what sparked your interest? Like, did you have family that was interested in these things? Are you multiple generations of physicians, or how did this all start?
The first thing is that, interestingly, we don't really have a very addictive family at all. The Jewish people, by the way, when you look at the genetics of Jewish people, and even in the gene that we first discovered with Bernie Noble and my group, the dopamine D2 receptor A1 form of that gene, which brings about almost a 40% reduction of dopamine D2 receptors in the brain, is only at 6% in the Jewish population. Now, of course, I'm Jewish from Brooklyn, you're from the Bronx, but the Jewish people have pretty low addictive behaviors, and my family didn't have hardly any addictive behaviors in it. So the answer to that one was no. Okay, I think what sparked my interest was that I went to Columbia and I decided to go into pharmacy, and the idea of pharmacy caught my attention. Especially, I got very interested in the idea of the brain as a young student at Columbia. That led to the work that I thought that I was very interested in, because I also did graduate work at the Presbyterian, at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, where you went, and I did some research involving stress and mucopolysaccharides. Had nothing to do with the brain. But then I got more interested in the brain as time went on. And when I did my master's degree, I did it at the Seton Hall College of Medicine, which turned into New Jersey College of Medicine. I started to look at dopamine in the periphery. And we did some original experiments. This was, by the way, in the 60s, early 60s, to show that dopamine was involved in peripheral tremoring. And they didn't even know that. I was a little just on the cuff of the Parkinson's story, okay? So dopamine was on my mind for a long time. And basically, when I got interested in it, had nothing to do with anybody addicted in the family, and it had nothing to do with the fact that I was worried about addiction. Although I could say that I was interested in psychedelics. I was interested in marijuana. I was interested in that kind of substances. I mean, I ended up going to see people at Melbourne, people that were involved, Timothy Leary and Barbara Ramdas, and people that were involved in the psychedelic world. So I was interested in it. But what really sparked my interest was that when I got my PhD was also involved with nutraceuticals like carnitine and how acetylcholine and acetylcarnitine can work at the neuromuscular junction. Well, when I finally went to Southwest Foundation and had a postdoc with Ervin Geller, he was involved in the whole idea of the beginning of behavioral pharmacology. He actually, with Gary Stein, opened up the whole field of psychopharmacology. This was in the late 50s, early 60s. So I went there. It was actually in 68. That's what started with. I got very interested in the brain. Then we decided to put a grant together. And if you know this, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse and the National Institutes of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse actually started in 1968. That's when it started. And we put one of the first grants in to suggest that stress would increase alcohol intake because it might change the neurotransmitters in the brain. We didn't focus only on dopamine. We looked at the number of the transmitters. And lo and behold, it's very interesting. We submitted that grant, and Ernest Noble, of all people, came to review the grant and interview us. And he suggested that we get the grant, okay? And we got the grant, and then we did the work. But guess what? We found that the only time stress increased alcohol intake was on the weekends, and not during the week, okay? So Ervin Geller came and said to me, he says, Ken, you're a pharmacologist, figure this out, So I said, what do you want from me? I said, okay. And what I figured it out is this. When he took animals, okay, and put them in a dark closet, because we went to Atlantic City, and Julius Axelrod was giving us a talk about circadian rhythm. And by the way, Ervin Geller worked with Julius Axelrod, okay? And he came back and he put these animals in the dark closet. They drank like crazy. And what we found out was that I said, okay, if we take animals in the light and inject them with melatonin, they should drink like crazy. And sure enough, that's what happened. They drank like crazy. And not only that, when we took blind lemmings, they drank like crazy. So that whole idea of melatonin and drinking was established, and the pineal gland was established for alcohol intake at that time. We published a number of papers on it. So that is what got my interest to kind of get addicted to doing research on the brain.
That's a fascinating story. If you put them in a dark closet with friends, with rat friends, would they drink less because they had some social connection, even though it's dark? Would that have changed anything? What do you think on that?
I think that you probably could be right. We didn't do that.
Yeah.
There's evidence that if you enrich the environment, you can reduce drinking.
Right.
So that would fit, but we never did that into the dark closet. That experiment reached Science magazine, got into Science. But guess what? My mentor, Ervin Geller, decided not to put my name on the paper. And he just slowly submitted it without me even knowing, okay? And he didn't even mention my name. He just said thank you to my staff, okay? So when I got that, I was a young guy, okay? And I was trying to make a career for myself. I thought it was a pretty good idea, right? So one of my technicians threw the Science magazine on my desk. I used to always get Science magazine. And I pick it up, I see this cover of a rat, with a tube drinking, I look at it, it said darkness induced drinking. I said, oh my God, I opened up Irving Geller, nobody else. What I did, listen to this, what I did is I took the magazine, I walked into his office, I threw it in his face, I said, I quit. He said, what? You can't quit. I quit. This is terrible. And you didn't even give me credit. Come up with this mechanism and idea that you put forward in this paper. So he said, you can't quit. So I called up my wife right from his office. I said, I'll show you. And I picked up the phone. I called my wife and I said, I just quit my job. She said, what? I'm pregnant. I said, with the second kid. I said, don't worry. I got a job by the time I come home. Now, I went to the medical school. This was 1972. I walked into the pharmacology department of the University of Texas, right? Tango. And I got a job because Arthur Briggs, the chairman, loved me. And he said, you got a job. You're going in as assistant professor, tenure track. Went out, got chocolates, and got flowers. Went home, told my wife I got a new job.
I mean,
Then I continued to work with the final thing.
I mean, look at the career you've had. So I think we're going to talk about a lot of different topics, but one of the big topics that you talk about is opioids, and we're going to talk about the reward deficiency syndrome. And you literally coined that yourself. It's accredited to you. People can Google it, and your name pops right up. I actually wanted to do it. I said reward deficiency syndrome. Boom, coined by Dr. Blum. Just from a lay perspective, can you tell our audience, and because I really try to hit on this, how bad is the opioid crisis in this country? And is it getting any better, in your opinion, or is it just something that we're just not getting on top of?
The answer to your question is a simple one. It's not getting better. It's not getting better. Even with the guidelines, okay, that came out with the CDC, we had over 100,000 people again die prematurely from opioid abuse in 2023, right? The estimation is by 2025 will be 165,000 people dying prematurely from opioids. In all due respect to Noah Volker and to George Krug, who I know both of them fairly well, they don't have a handle on it. They do not know how to solve the problem. What I would like to do today with you is talk about there is a possibility of how we can solve the problem. I'm not listening.
It's such a problem. I mean, I remember we were talking about the opioid crisis when I was in medical school, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And yet I see addicted patient after addicted patient coming through my doors now. A lot of them are first timers that I'm seeing, but they have spinal problems that have, frankly, a lot of them have people always think, oh, it's the patients that have had, previous surgery and it didn't work. A lot of people are just native vets. No one's ever touched their spine with a surgery, but yet they are completely addicted to, narcotics. And it makes it so difficult for us as surgeons to manage them, preoperatively, to do anything that will, help them. But it makes it like really hard to manage them postoperatively. So we try to get pain management involved. We try to do this, and they're all on, stuff. I mean, in extreme cases, they're like on fentanyl lollipops and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so we obviously send them for counseling and to try to get them down as much as we can. And then also, one of the things, and I'd like to get your opinion on, is also these pain pumps, right? Because when you give opioid into the spinal cord, it's infinitely more powerful. And so they're addicted in a different way. I mean, they might not be systemically addicted, but they sure are addicted. Their spinal cord's very addicted to, to drugs. And so it's such a massive problem. That's why I'm so excited that you're on here, because I really want to break down what steps we really can take to try to get some type of handle on it, because with so many chronic diseases, and this is one we'll call the opioid, thing. It's a problem. We're going in the wrong direction with so much chronic stuff in this country, including obesity and type 2 diabetes, which, has exploded, and opioid crisis. I mean, how many crises are we dealing with simultaneously?
Very good points. Maybe I could address a couple, okay?
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to say this. We have done a study. It's by Moran et al. It's published in Molecular Neurobiology a couple of years ago. The study was done because people are coming into a pain clinic. Well, a lot of these people were on opioids for over 1 year. Okay. Other people got out of it. These other people were there for a year on opioids. They kept complaining. So Mark Moran was the pain doc, and we put together a study, which we can refer to a little bit later if you want. It's called the Genetic Addiction Risk Severity Test, called GARS, which I developed, patented. And this test could assess what we call pre-addiction, okay? And we looked at the people that were using high amounts of opioids for over a year, okay? And when we measured the GARS test on these individuals, over 90% carried the genes that were DNA antecedents for all addictive behaviors like RDS, okay? Suggests that maybe when people come into clinics like yours, like spine clinics, like pain clinics, do a GARS test, find out what their propensity is for being addicted to opioids and other drugs, even behaviors, but worry about opioids. And you could actually separate buckets. Problem is, you asked the question beforehand that I didn't really answer. You asked me, why are we so different? Or why are we the same as the world population? And the WHO organization suggests that the number of people that are addicted in the world are 2.2% out of 8 billion people, okay? Like 176 million, something like that, right? And when you think about it, the United States is the worst. I have a suggestion, okay? Let's think about this. If you are living in the 1700s, late 1700s, and you're in Britain, England, all of a sudden you got an idea. I'm going to leave my country because they're taxing me too much. And I'm going to go all the way down by boat with my family and everything into this unknown paradise that has Indians. They didn't even know they had Indians. And I'm going to risk my life to get out of this oppression from the British government, okay? Now, what kind of people do you think came to America? These are people that had tremendous survival instincts. And one of the things we know is that the polymorphisms or the variations, the gene variations and different gene forms in the dopamine system, okay, associated with high survival instincts, just like the one we discovered to associate with alcoholism, the DRD2 gene, okay? So my 2 cents is that when I start genotyping people in America, and we did so because I had the genetic addiction risk severity test out commercially for a number of years. We did 4,000 tests. Guess what? A high percentage, above 85%, believe it or not, carried the DNA antecedents for pre-addiction, meaning that people in America, believe it or not, are highly addictive kind of individuals, and they got the so-called addiction personality, which they used to say many years ago. But the genetics is such that they have this particular addictiveness. And that's why I think we're seeing so much addiction in the United States, besides the overprescriptions and all the other stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never heard anybody promote that. It's fascinating. It makes a lot of sense because really almost all peoples that came here, whether they came here willingly or unwillingly, had to go through tremendous, journeys, and the ones, only a certain amount survived, whether it was whatever. So I mean, we are a bunch of survivors, and it is also our culture, right? Like that is our culture. We're a very addictive culture, so it plays into everything. We're addicted to food. We are addicted to the internet. We are, if you ask scammers, why they prey on the United States? Because we're just addicted to anything. We get that high right away. They're
That's
like,
real.
hey, there's
Yeah.
$10 million in your bank account, and they're just calling like random people, and people are like, oh my God, I'm rich. I'll give you, and they're like, we just need, 20,000, and then it can unlock 10 million. And just, we're so willing to take those types of risks. So I think part of it is that, but I wonder if there's some other just kind of environmental factors, just the way we think. It's just like, it's just culture. It's kind of like a mass psychosis. We're all like ready to we're just big time risk takers, and maybe that feeds into it too. But that's a fascinating theory. Have you written anything on that? Because I didn't see that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've written on it in different ways. I'll try to get you some of it because it's all over the place. I'll try to get you something about it because I write about it as I go along. But I didn't have a whole paper just dedicated to that. I probably
Okay,
should.
okay. Yeah, it's
Probably
fun.
should.
It's just an interesting
Yeah,
theory.
I probably should. But what I want to say to you, because you hit on something really important, and you just talked about the environment, okay? So I think what people have to realize, and this is all, even lay people, and doctors, and nurses, and anybody that's tuning in, okay? There's a simple mathematical formula, okay? Now, a phenotype can be anything from the color of your hair to how you behave, okay? So the formula is that P equals G plus E, right? That means that the phenotype, which could be addictiveness, right, is equal to your genes, right, plus the environment. Now,
Right.
probably now it's going on, say, 15 years since we understand the idea of epigenetics, okay? The term epigenetics simply just means that the environment can bring about a impact on the expression, okay, of the RNA of the genes. It doesn't really change the DNA, but that expression, by the way, could go forward for 2 generations at least, okay? And the interesting thing about that is that with epigenetics, just to give you a quick 101 of epigenetics, and for your listening audience, all epigenetics says is that if you have a positive relationship with your parents, the people around you, the environment, you're going to get a biochemical reaction. That biochemical reaction is going to be that on top of the chromosome, okay, of genes, these sugar molecules called histones. And when you get a positive reaction, you're going to acetylate the histones. But when you get a negative reaction, you're going to methylate the histones. Now, if you acetylate the histones, increase expression of the RNA, a particular protein, okay, that's coming from the gene, right? The code. But if you're going to have negative input, you're going to get methylation. That's going to stop the expression of RNA. So it's the combination of the genes plus the environment that's going to bring about whatever phenotype you're looking at. And I just wanted to explain that because that's a very important part of understanding the molecular neurobiology of how the brain is working.
That's a great primer for what we're going to get into. And, one of the things I've become pretty obsessed with, everything was about procedures for me initially, and doing all the latest and greatest and all this stuff, and trying to be at the forefront, of my field. But then when I just started seeing people that were so ill all the time and on so many medications, I just started thinking, something's not right here. So I started going down this wellness rabbit hole, and I love the concept of epigenetics. And I talk to my patients about very simply, and it just goes like this: the more you expose yourself to negative, environmental factors, and that's the food you put in your mouth, the nutrition you take in, the amount of sleep like having poor sleep, and then toxins, environmental toxins, anywhere from plastics to, benzene and tires, and all kinds of stuff, even like 5G towers and things like that. There's a lot of talk about that, and interfering with cellular health. I mean, you're turning on and off genes, but the more of these toxins or high sugar diets and you know the drill, the more you're affecting your body. And that's how we get into these metabolic health crises. And that fits right into your fascinating work with the reward deficiency syndrome, because it's really how things get turned on and what kind of genes people have, and then kind of what that, you know, downstream effect. It's really fascinating. And, you know, reading your book on the 12 steps and correlating it with kind of like neurobiology, it's just fascinating, because you guys you talk about like happiness, like, you know, maybe genes of happiness. So it's so fascinating. And it's fascinating to me because by making lifestyle changes and this is like specifically for my patients and people, you know, we deal with, it literally can turn the genes on that you want and turn off the genes you don't want, which then doesn't put you into a metabolic crisis, which may prevent you from getting, you know, early onset Alzheimer's disease, or getting type 2 diabetes, or or getting anxiety, whatever it is. I mean, we could go on. We can do a list of 100 things that I always preach as it's man-made. I mean, we're making these illnesses, and people need to just say it. It's not right. You know, there's only a small percentage of genes that are definite, right? Most of them can be turned on and turned off, and then they get expressed through mRNA, exactly like you said. But it's the environment. It's what that environment is doing. You know, one of the things I said with Barron, it was a great quote that I heard. I just love this quote. And that is, the genes loaded the gun for the most part, but we're pulling the trigger.
We're pulling the trigger. You know something? I don't know. I put that on top of one of my papers.
Okay. It's all, you know, that's funny.
Yeah. And the other thing that people should realize is that when epigenetics came into forefront, the slogan of the epigeneticists, like Eric Nestor and other people, basically love your pups. And if the families and parents would understand that as they abuse kids, even though they think they're disciplining them in the right direction, it's terrible. It really affects their brain and how their brain function is. And it's not easy to get out of the epigenetics. I call it state. It's not trait, state. Trait is genes, state is environment. So that's important. You got to love your pops.
No, I love that. I think on that note, I want you to give a sort of a primer now on the reward deficiency syndrome. I believe you coined that in 1996, if I'm correct. You probably were thinking about it for a long time before that, but I think it was officially kind of recognized 1996, unless I'm wrong. But if you can give us a primer on it, it's fascinated me. I wish we had some of the diagrams. I might try to put some of the diagrams into some of the kind of the pre, you know, podcast release of showing kind of that cascade, you know, that with the reward deficiency syndrome. I'll let you talk on it. You coined the term.
Well, thank you. Actually, I coined the term in 1995. There was one paper that came out in functional neurology.
Okay.
Where we did what we call a Bayesian theorem to determine what is the chance that if people have a long list of addictions, substances, alcohol, cocaine, heroin, all the substances, psychostimulants, behaviors, eating disorder, go down the list, shopping, what would be the chance that if you had these disorders, based on having the dopamine D2 receptor A1 allele, because that was the gene that we found in 1990 that we published in JAMA, my lab and Ernie Noble's lab at UCLA. By having that variation, things about low dopamine receptors, like I said earlier, okay, to you privately, the answer was the predictive value. Okay, if you carry just this one gene with this variation, with reduced D2 receptors in the brain, for example, okay, is 74.4%. So that means if you carry that gene, there's a chance that you can be addicted to one of these behaviors. Now, the way I came up with this is a kind of story, is that I was on a plane. I was going, I think, to Kentucky for some reason, to give a talk, I imagine. And I said to myself, what is going on here? Okay. It don't make sense. Okay. Because people that got alcohol problems, you know, I also like cocaine. People that get cocaine are like even heroin. People that use drugs seem to want to, they have, if their father was an alcoholic and they're a child of an alcoholic, they don't want to become like their dad, but they get heavy. That means they're linked to some substances that are going to make them feel good. Okay. So the idea was that we, when I was thinking about it, was reward. Okay. The idea that we have to feel good as human beings. Okay. But is it too much of something or is it too little of something? Is it sufficiency that messes you up or is it deficiency that messes you up? And I finally, after agonizing, said, I think it has to be deficiency. Okay. Not that sufficiency don't count, but the real culprit is reward deficiency. And then I said, well, you know something? I think I just came up with something. It sounds like autoimmune deficiency syndrome, like AIDS. That's why I'm gonna coin it. Reward deficiency syndrome. That's how I came up with it. Okay. And that was in 1995. Okay. And we published that one paper. But then in 1996, I published the idea in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And once you publish there, bango, it's out. And during that time, I was asked by American scientists to write a layman's version of reward deficiency syndrome, which I penned on April 18th, 1995. No, 1996. And that's how that idea came out. Now, to give you the excitement that happened was one of my dear friends, Elliot Gardner, who's came out of Einstein, is now the chief of the molecular neurological branch at NIDA, called me up. And I'm not going to use what he said, but basically said, you son of a, what? Why are you yelling at me, Elliot? Because I should have come up with that name. So that name has been out there. And to tell you the truth, like anything else, the naysayers all the time. Whenever you come up with something, you're going to have naysayers. The naysayers have been going on and on and on and on. There's still naysayers. But the world in general, I think, is embracing and endorsing that idea of reward deficiency syndrome. Because remember, we're linking the commonality between substance abuse and behavioral addictions, whether it's smartphone addiction, shopping, hoarding, gambling, sex addiction, overeating addiction. It's all linked because when you look at studies, there's many neuroimaging studies, there's many GY studies that absolutely suggest, okay, that the culprit, okay, is dopamine dysregulation, primarily deficiency rather than sufficiency, okay? And I can explain to you as we go forward, I can explain to you the fact that what we have just found in some very recent work about using GY's meta-analysis and pharmacogenomics, we can explain to you really what we're finding out now. It's amazing.
And that was a great primary. You know, talk about the reward deficiency syndrome and the difference in sort of the alleles and things that you're finding. So how that plays in. So it's certain people. Why are certain people? So I want to just make it clear to the audience. This is like a fascinating topic. And I'm just telling everybody, the people that are going to be listening to this, 99% of them have never heard, these terms. So why, in your theory, are certain people more susceptible to becoming addicted?
Okay, that's a very important and interesting question. I think we got to go back just a little bit, okay? What's missing in the discussion, okay, is that this is an interesting story, by the way, that up to 1990, no one, absolutely no one, ever found a gene that associated with alcoholism, okay? I embarked on a study with Ernie Noble, okay, from UCLA, who was the former director of the National Institutes of Alcoholism, okay? The study was a study in which we stated that we were going to use brain tissue from people that died from alcoholism compared to brain tissue of people that did not. And we were going to look at a number of genes that may impact the whole idea of alcoholism, okay? And what I did is I called up Ernie Noble and I said, Ernie, and he knew me, we were doing a lot of things together. I said, Ernie, how'd you like to find the first gene for alcoholism? He said, yeah, sure can. You know, you're in the dream world. Sure, okay, yeah. Should I hang up now? He said, no. And I told him what my idea was. And as I was speaking to him, he had a secretary, his name was Annie. Annie, get me a plan. I'm going directly to San Antonio. And he showed up, and we outlined the whole study. And this was in 1987. And then we got money to do this research, not from the government, but from the Seaver Foundation. And we penned the article where we found that the single gene, the dopamine D2A1 allele, associated with alcoholism at 79%. Okay? And we published it in JAMA. Now, when we sent it to JAMA, George Lundberg, who was the editor-in-chief of JAMA, called Ernie Noble and I happened to be there. And he said, my God, you guys, this is amazing. You found the first gene for alcoholism. I said, yeah, we did. So he says, hang on. I'm going to call Annie Gordis, the now director after Ernie, for the National Institute of Alcoholism. I want to have a meeting on the steps of the NIAAA. Okay? Called them up. Enoch, I got Ken Blum and Ernie Noble on the phone. They just found the first gene for alcoholism. Huh? We want to do a press release right with you in the front of the National Institutes of Alcoholism, Alcohol Abuse. And he hemmed and hawed and basically said no. Okay? And Boris Tamakov was the director, who was our friend. He wrote an editorial basically saying, this can't be possible. Okay? So in 1990, we published the first gene for addiction, which then turns out to be very important. But that all links in to the whole concept of reward deficiency syndrome, because that was the first understanding that there can be a genetic component to make people more addicted than other people are. And you asked the question, what makes us addicted? And what we have done in 2014, to flash forward, is I developed something called the Genetic Addiction Risk Severity Test, called GARS. And that test has 10 genes with the variations that reduce the function of those genes that are all across the brain. That, by the way, you mentioned it, the brain reward cascade, which you showed that picture, which we developed in 1989. That gave us the blueprint to put that together. And I'll explain later how important that is. But that's, so if you carry, and we did a big study on this, if you carry 4 of those, we call them alleles or variants, okay? You have a potential addictiveness to drugs like opioids. If you carry 7 drugs and alcohol, okay, probably other behaviors. So that is my thinking as to what really brings about addictiveness in world population, not just America. But America's probably gotten pretty bad, pretty bad. So does that help explain it?
For the scope of what we're talking about, it's amazing. I just want people that are listening to just really hear what you're saying and how it's so important, because some of these concepts are new to me, because this is not public. It's public knowledge, but right, we only find what we're looking for. And so if we're looking for what everybody tells us to look for, we don't find it. But to have a test that we as physicians or whatever, or that can just be taken on even on a more broad scale, that can be given by providers, or people can even get a home test that, I don't know how broad this is going to become available, but to have a test as a physician to know if I operate on this patient, or if this patient has an injury, and this is for opioid, I'm talking about opioid addiction, to know beforehand, boy, this person has 7 out of 10 of the alleles that are not what we want. We might handle that situation differently, where we might be able to get more psychiatrists or have more social support or whatever we need. We might look at that patient different, as opposed to somebody that has 1 out of 10 that maybe we can say, well, we can just treat them normally and they're not going to get addicted to this. They're fine. They'll do their course of meds and it's not a problem. But the way that I see this, even on a bigger scale, is using these types of tests really to just try to help the just kind of people, the way people are being treated for other addictions. And one of the big things that I always talk about is the addiction to food and the obesity crisis, which we're dealing with. And then, and the addiction to sugars, which is not just the obesity crisis, but it's the crisis of diabetes and everything that goes along with the dysfunction in brain health that goes along with high sugars and having all this dysregulation. And so having a test that's able to pinpoint who's at more risk and who actually needs more intensive work to put them in a safer place where we can treat them more effectively is fascinating. The fact that this is not a widely available test, in other words, it might be widely available, but if I don't know about it, I clearly am not going to order it as a physician, right? I'm not going to order test B if I only heard about test A, because that's all that is being pushed by either, mainstream media or the mainstream medical complex or whatever you want to call it. And so the potential, when I started going down and reading this stuff over the last couple of weeks, and I'd be honest with you, it's completely new to me. I mean, I've never had somebody knock on my door and say, hey, you should be, using the GARS test for your patients, and it might completely change your course of action on them. I think as a physician, I'm blown away with how important something like this can be. And I'm sure that inside, like deep inside, as somebody who came up with this quite a while ago, it's frustrating when there's been pushback on something, which is, to me, just from what I've learned about it, is a no-brainer. Like, what's your level of frustration that this is not something that physicians have not just physicians, but just providers in general have accepted and said, hey, we need to make this part of our workup?
Well, of course I'm frustrated. But let me say this. Part of the problem is, okay, that a pushback to something like this is somewhat interesting. Because if I was not Ken Blum, and I represented one of the big pharmaceutical companies, I'm not going to give any names because it don't matter. But if it came out of a major pharmaceutical company, or Genentech, or biotech company, oh, wow, that might be great, okay? The second pushback is, how in the world could you say that 10 genes with 11 polymorphisms or variations, okay, could detect whether or not an individual has a pre-addiction, okay, is crazy, because there are so many genes in the genome, and if you take the 30,000, and now they're arguing, what's functional or not. There's so many genes. How could only 10 genes describe the fact that someone's going to have this pre-addiction? So the argument there is it's too little, the number of genes. They rather do GWise. GWise, do find hundreds of genes, 50 genes, 1,000 genes, but you can't commercialize that, okay? So I went ahead and I commercialized the GARS test from my own company, okay? And we had it out in a company called Genus Health, okay? And we did about 4,000 tests. COVID came, company was bought by something else, went bankrupt. Now it's out. Now I'm in the middle of trying to raise a significant amount of money to get it back out again, which I think we're going to be doing pretty soon. But here is the interesting thing that I like to nail it into the call. Here's what I mean. We have just done what we call pharmacogenomics. It's a PGX analysis. We have done what we call a GWise meta-analysis. We have now evidence from 88.86 million GWise samples that the GARS test is indeed a test can accurately measure the phenotype called pre-addiction. And we're submitting that paper to Science, by the way, in the next week or so. And we have another paper that we're going to, a follow-up that also proves it to another journal. The point of the matter is that when we did this analysis, and the analysis comes from a individual working with me and Dr. Lewandowski, who I told you about, is a spine doctor from Iran. Lewandowski is from Arizona, but Ali Sharish is from Iran. He's a PhD, just getting his PhD. The point is that not only does this work show that the GARS test can accurately measure pre-addiction, it shows that reward deficiency syndrome is indeed the phenotype for pre-addiction, but 88.8 million samples to prove it. Okay?
Real.
So the argument that people have been stating that gave me great frustration is the fact that they said no one in his right mind could use candidate genes to state that you could have a accurate assessment of something called pre-addiction, which, by the way, the term was first coined in 1970, but McClellan and Volker and Koob put out a paper in 2022, said the missing term in substance abuse is pre-addiction. They have not defined it correctly, okay? We felt that pre-addiction phenotype was reward deficiency syndrome. I'm going to say this very strongly now. I rest my case. Based on 88.8.6 million samples, GWise, meta-analysis, pre-addiction is indeed RDS.
As a physician myself that has gone down looking at quote unquote different things, they call everything alternative that is not, part of the mainstream medicine. Everything's alternative. I just say, no, it's a different treatment. There's how many different forms of medicine there are. There's food as medicine. There's light therapy. There's oxygen. There's just so many different things out there. I just do not like the term alternative, but anytime something is outside of whatever that box is, there is so much pushback in the kind of the medical community, and it becomes frustrating because, again, this is something that I've done a lot of reading on in the last 2 weeks, and just from it makes sense. And yes, is it possible that that you have these 10 allele, whatever, and maybe there's really, and you might find another 5. It doesn't matter because you are capturing such a large portion. It's like all these other tests, right? There's things called sensitivity and specificity. Every test we have doesn't pick up everything, right?
Right.
But if I tell you that everybody that eats apples is probably going to die, that's enough for me to stop eating. I mean, I'm not going to do it, right? That's enough. I don't need to be like, well, that's not completely, I knew a guy, he ate apples and he lived to
Oh,
105.
awesome.
Well, right? Like, or whatever. Yeah, that doesn't even make sense. I mean, it sounds like that this GARS test it picks up enough people that are predisposed to risk, and worst case scenario, if they are put into a box where they are pre-addicted, at least we are going to pay more attention to maybe some of the different steps that we can do to try to avoid them going down that path. There is nothing wrong with trying to prevent something from happening. It's not like if they take the GARS test and they're labeled as pre-addiction that we're going to do a frontal lobotomy because that's the treat. No, that's not what we're doing. We're just making sure that we give them more. Like the way I would use it, it's like I would give these people more resources to be able to understand that they are at risk for potentially going down a bad path. And we would like them to just be, we just want to be more attentive to those needs and maybe manage it a little bit differently. It's frustrating. I mean, I'm frustrated. And again, I've just gotten, like to learn about this because you were generous enough to, to come on the show. And it's just fascinating work. I'm just going to take it a little bit to the side and then we're going to go back. Do you see, and now I see the potential for this test also to be potentially used in, for example, other, like you said, other addictions. But again, one of my passions is food addiction. And it's so bad because we are surrounded by just these toxic food environments and commercials everywhere. And we've normalized eating like just awful. It's like the American diet is nothing short. It's almost criminal, but we're not going to, I don't want to go down that route. However, looking at the way we manage them from a psychological standpoint, if we know they fall into a category where they're going to be extra resistant to make changes, just knowing that because they have an addictive kind of predisposition, I think would be tremendously beneficial, even like for docs that deal primarily with obesity and weight management, to treat them a little bit differently. Have you thought a lot about that, maybe how using it in stemming the obesity crisis? Because there's nothing, I mean, it can't be called anything other than a catastrophe right now.
Okay, actually, that's a great point. We have about 20 papers that suggest that we look at the genetics of obesity involving GARS. And the GARS absolutely picks up the same common mechanism as if it was an opiate or alcohol or psychostimulants. So there is no question in my mind, and we have definitely pushed the idea of genetic testing for obesity. Now, let me give you one very important thing. This, I think, will really blow your mind away. So I did some work with a Dr. Peter Tannis. Tannis was a graduate student of Noah Volker from Brookhaven. He's at the University of Buffalo. He's a dear friend of mine, and we do a lot of work together. So we looked at bariatric patients, highly obese, and they went through post-surgery. And we did the GARS test on the bariatric patients. And I mean, there's so many fantastic links to the fact that the GARS assessed the fact that they would have an anticipatory romance with food. And it pointed out the seriousness of people that had obesity, had very high GARS, very high GARS scores, okay? So here you have overeating and obesity in bed. We have two papers. One was 6 months, and then we did a follow-up surgery for 12 months. And we used the GARS as a basis with a lot of questionnaires. And we got tremendous results. And the results could actually tell the bariatric doctor, do the test, and then tell your patient whether or not they would be, what the proneness is to guess what? Other drugs of abuse, like alcoholism. Over 20 to 40% of people that have bariatric surgery become alcoholics.
Yes,
So,
yes,
so,
that's actually a yeah,
so
yeah.
we're telling the bariatric surgeon, and it was all done, the bariatric surgeons, by the way, that, hey, stop a minute. This is a way of talking to your patient. We also show them that, believe it or not, if you carry the DRD2A1 allele, you would do better in terms of being sticking to your regime of not eating. But in the same token, you got to be careful because you might go into other abusable substances like alcohol. So this is a way of counseling people and a way of knowing what you're seeing instead of guessing. So it fits tremendously
Yes.
to the entire obesity problem. And we've been saying that. And obesity is one of the subsets of reward deficiency syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It makes sense because being able, everything we do in medicine, right, is trying to stratify who should have what.
Yeah.
And having a test to be able to say, this is a good candidate, this is not a good candidate. There's so much more that we can be doing to counsel patients. And, the obesity world, and I plan on having, I mean, I've already talked obesity on the show, but I'm going to have a couple of bariatric surgeons too. I'm going to ask them about the GARS test. I'm sure that most of them, I don't know. Maybe they do. Maybe that's something that they know about.
Well, maybe they've read the recent papers. I'll send you the recent papers.
No, I love it. No, I think it's fascinating, but actually having a way to stratify those patients, because I think right now they're in the world of obesity. Okay, there is these camps are being formed. Okay, one camp is the bariatric surgery, and I think there's patients that are actually good candidates for bariatric surgery, but it's very small. And I think bariatric surgeons have come to realize over the last, especially like 10 years, that there's just certain people that it's not the right thing because they're not even able to follow any of their pre-surgery programs and things. So there's all these different stratifications that have happened, and I think that's great because it's just one tool. And then there's the camp that is staunchly in the changes in lifestyle modification. And I tend to fall into that camp because I think that a lot of these things are preventable, especially with proper education. And if they're caught early and if we get them down the right means, and there's just so much to do from a lifestyle. But I also agree that there are times where, medication management can be effective, including like metformin and things like that. But the thing we talked about offline before we started, which is something that I brought up many times, and I can tell you, man, there are staunch opposition, but there's also like tremendous advocacy right now of like the GLP-1s. And my position as a person who does not prescribe GLP-1s, obviously that's just not my role, is that I'm sure that there's, like any medication, there's always a role in situations for medications. But I can tell you, even myself personally, I know so many people that I work with that are around me that are on GLP-1s that could have managed their care absolutely with life. They're not even morbidly obese. They're like somewhat obese. And I feel like it's almost a reaction. It's just like SSRIs where, right? You're sad? SSRI. Like nothing to do. So these GLP-1s, it's just another, camp. And so, I wonder if you could tell us about, what the upsides might be of GLP-1s and what the downsides may be on the brain, because one of the things that's fascinated me and makes me call a timeout on GLP-1s, and I don't mean timeout like no one should be on it ever, but the fact that it actually binds to receptors in the brain. It doesn't just affect the gut, right? It's a brain thing. It changes your brain, and the fact that now it's approved down to age 12 and they're studying it down to age 6 without having any clue on what the long-term developmental, outcome is going to be in children. I mean, they really don't know. How can you know? There's no, you need time if to do longitudinal studies. And so I wonder what your take is on those. I know it's a little off topic, but something that came up, and I see you nodding your head. So I'm sure you have something to say on this.
I got a lot to say. But
Go.
I'm making it as simple as possible. Okay. If we remember, people were dying to lose weight with something called fen-phen. Okay. And they died from cardiovascular problems. And the FDA, for some reason, did not make a big deal that that could really be a problem. And look how many people lost their lives because the FDA did not do a good job. Okay. I came out at that time with a product that went commercial, and it was a nutraceutical that we called KB220, called Fencal. It was the #1 weight loss product in the supplement field that fought against the fen-phen. Okay. Now, the FDA, that's not a story. But the point is this, that when I looked at GLP-1 agonists, okay, first I was intrigued. I thought, oh, wow, this stimulates and has a positive impact on dopamine. Okay. Now, I can tell you, I spent weeks after weeks reading everything I could read about what's in the literature on GLP-1 agonists and GLP-1. And they start talking about substance abuse, for example, okay? Not just obesity. The diabetic thing, there's evidence that it might have direct effects. But listen to this. Then I finished my research in looking at all of this. I figured out there's something wrong. And here's what is wrong. When you look at some of the studies, Stefano, it states in the title of a paper, GLP-1 agonist induces dopamine homeostasis, dopamine balance. Absolutely wrong, okay? What they really have shown, that if you have a hyper dopaminergia, it can bring it back going towards less dopamine. Why? Now, let me tell you why. The primary effect of GLP-1 is to reduce dopaminergic function. The primary effect of GLP-1 agonists is exactly that. What it does, it increases the GABAergic input to the ventral tegmental area, the area of the brain that has glutamatergic substances that, when stimulated, cause the release of dopamine downstream at the reward site of the nucleus accumbens. If you increase the GABAergic activity that the GLP-1 agonist does, what happens? You get a hypodopaminergia. You get a low dopamine release. Bad. Okay? It also increases the activity of the dopamine transporter, which reabsorbs the dopamine out of the synapse to get rid of it. Again, hypodopaminergia. We have paper on paper on paper, not just from my lab, but from labs all over the world, showing that if you have a low dopamine, you have an increase in cocaine abuse, alcohol abuse, heroin abuse, eating abuse, substance abuse, all kinds, activity abuse. So, but the thing that really, really bothered me is when I read that there were 256 people that the FDA pinpointed that have died potentially as a result of using GLP-1 for depression. And the European Medical Agency had 156. And using, listen to this, using our GWISE studies and the pharmacogenomic studies that my colleagues, Ali Sharif, Taylor Wendesky, and others have put together, we have actually determined the exact pathway of how GLP-1 will cause depression. We have submitted a paper to Nature. They didn't take it. Now we submitted it to the Journal of Neurological Sciences. We have told the world that if they dare use GLP-1 to treat addictive behavior, they're going to have suicide on their hands, suicide ideation on their hands. And now people, instead of dying from heart problems, are going to die from depression. This is serious, and this is bad science. And even the giants of the field have not figured that out yet, and they're pushing it. I hate to say it. I don't want to say it. I don't want to say it because I don't want to hate involved. But let's put it this way. It's the wrong thing to do, besides all the adverse effects. In fact, one of my colleagues have taken it, okay, and had hemiplegic migraines every single day until he stopped taking it, besides thyroid problems, other adverse effects. And I'm not, look, if this was a GLP-1 agonist that did the job the way they thought it was, with a balanced dopamine, I'm 100% for it. It's the opposite. That's my 2 cents.
That definitely rings some alarm bells. I had another guest on the show, Dr. Myers, who developed this proportion fit diet, and he actually brought up that notion of depression, because that's out there. I mean, people are beginning to talk about that in addiction to other substances and things, and that that theory about like the reward center, that you're getting low dopamine, it makes a ton of sense. And obviously that's going to lead to the depressive syndromes and other things, not to mention, like loss of gastric emptying. There's a lot of lawsuits that are going on with that, and just generally feeling bad, sometimes when you're on it, just to not eat food. But meanwhile, so I have to do, more digging on that. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time, and you guys are, I'm sorry that Nature didn't pick up your paper on that, because it's so important, and you want it early. And so I am going to make sure that, especially that segment of the show, really, I'm going to try to really push that far and wide, because it's really important. Nobody's talking about this stuff. In fact, I actually, on a while ago, all I did was ask a question on LinkedIn. I asked the question. I just asked about like GLP-1s and the possibilities that we're missing some of the potential downstream side effects. And I can tell you, I got some pushback, because right away they're like, no, this is great. It's a miracle. It's helping everybody. And like this is, you can, as a physician, push back on any of these things. And I wasn't even pushing back. I'm just asking. So I feel like my role that I've taken on, outside of being a spine surgeon, as a spine surgeon, I can say, I'm an expert in that stuff. My role in this other field, and trying to bring very important, what I feel are critical topics for the general population to really get a hold of. My role is to bring on experts like yourself that literally have dedicated their entire lives, right? That have, resumes so long. Like I said, we don't have enough paper in the printer to even, print it out. We need to be listening to people that are sounding the alarm bells, because sometimes when people sound the alarm bells, it's real. Like, if you think about like the Challenger disaster, how many people sounded the alarm bells on that? And then that goes true for anything like major airline crashes and all these other things. But people right away, they just want to, and I, going back to what we talked about before, I'm finding that because, as we're building these wellness centers, we're offering like really low, like almost no risk, modalities, things like oxygen therapy and red light and stuff. And there is a segment of the community. Number one, they're super skeptical. They're like, that's too simple. There's no way that can do anything, even though there's 5,000 studies out there on photobiomodulation, right? But more, I don't even mind if the skepticism, because I understand people are just so tied into, oh, I just get a pill and I'm going to be fine, or I just go get a surgery and it'll fix me. It's the serious pushback that you get. And then you have to start thinking about, without getting political and going down those tracks. And I know you had a lot of self-restraint there with not really wanting to say everything. And I also sit in that seat where I can say some stuff, but I have to, I also want to keep an open mind the other way. I don't want to convince myself of one thing and then I end up being wrong. So I especially as somebody that's also functioning as somebody that's trying to just kind of glean knowledge from everybody and bring it out, I want to keep an open mind, but we have to be really, people have to think, like, why are they so resistant to sometimes such obvious things like what you're saying, like, oh, a new drug that's being pushed, like I've never seen anything pushed like this in my career. It's like the number one thing I've ever seen pushed that any of us has ever seen. This is the biggest marketing campaign, and everybody's involved. And again, I'm not saying there's no role for anybody, because there are patients, it's an emergency, they're 450 pounds and they're not going to do anything. And I get it. If you want to take the risk on those patients, then that's fine. But we have to just think, why is there such a push for pharmaceuticals and procedures, right? And I've been in that world. I lived that world for a long time. And why is there not a push for the opposite? Nutraceuticals, red light therapy, class 4 laser therapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation, all these other things. Why are we pushing everything has to be like some, crazy Alzheimer's drug that has such a tiny, peripheral like effect just at the margins, instead of looking at other potential therapies that could be dramatically of benefit? So people have to really, and a lot of this show, and sorry to go on a rant, but a lot of this show has to do with really trying to cut through the noise and bringing the audience real stuff from real experts, not Joe, whatever, that's trying to sell you some product on Instagram. I mean, people that have dedicated their lives to getting this information out, not some for a company that wants to put, obviously they're going to push their stuff. That's literally their job. We want to get it from the foremost experts. So I really thank you on your notion. Now, I do want to get back to the obesity thing and the potential use, not just for obesity, but the opioids crisis, and using some of these nutraceuticals, which from my understanding really will balance, quote unquote, the dopamine environment. Can you talk about nutraceuticals, how they work and how they might work in all of these, addictive behaviors?
That's a topic that I really love, of course. First of all, let me just say this. Just one little sideline that I want to say that we talked before. Look, why is the FDA coming out so early in the game and say that they don't believe that GLP-1 agonists can induce depression? Leave it as it is. They are fooling the world by saying that and hurting the world. They shouldn't do that, okay? Now I'll go back to what answer your question, okay? Nutraceuticals. So it goes back to 1976, okay? When I was doing a lot of animal research, okay, at the University of Texas. One of the things that were very interesting to me was when they came up with the idea that there's these opioid-like substances in the brain, POPD, if you call it, okay? And why are these opioid-like substances in the brain? And I remember going to a meeting of the Gordon Research Conference in Pennsylvania, the early house, where Adam Goldstein was the chair. And we had to come up, 100 people are only allowed to go to the meeting. And we had to come up with a name, okay, for this opioid peptide floating around in the brain. And we came to the next day with names. Everybody threw out names, all kind of names. And finally, Eric Simon from NYU jumps up, says, I got the name. Okay, Eric, what is it? Endorphins. Endogenous morphine. Beautiful. stuck. Okay. When we finally understood that the endorphins were definitely in the brain, and everybody thought that all it meant was that it was involved with opioids, no one took the step to say that it's also involved in alcoholism. And I did the first experiment to show that the narcotic antagonist, naloxone, blocked alcohol-induced dependence, published in Nature. And that opened up the idea that there was something in common between alcohol and opioids. Okay, I wrote a book on it, by the way, 1978. I'm telling you this because at the time, I said, my God, if I could find a way where I could increase the expectancy, the life expectancy of the endorphins in the brain to make it easier, it's called Keflin. If I could do something like that, I could reduce alcohol intake. So I came upon, in 1933, in a biochemistry book, there is a substance that was used to block the activity of the enzyme carboxypeptidase, which is an enzyme which would destroy peptides. And Keflin is, it's peptides, okay? And this enzyme cuts it, and you lose the activity. So I used a substance that could inhibit carboxypeptidase. That substance was called D-phenylalanine. You must have heard of it.
Absolutely.
L-phenylalanine. And we were the first one to show in animals that love to drink that we could reduce the intake by injecting D-phenylalanine for 18 days in these animals, and I could knock out the drinking. In C57 black mice that love to drink, compared to DBA mice that hated to drink, and when I got done with these mice, their level of drinking was even lower than the DBAs that love to drink. That was the first pharmacogenomic experiment. What happened was we used the substance D-phenylalanine, which inhibited the enzyme carboxypeptidase, which destroyed peptides. The endorphin is a peptide, the keflin is a peptide. We showed that we were able to increase the amount of the endorphin in the brain, okay, and reduce alcohol intake. And did many, many experiments after that. And that was just the beginning of the use of a nutraceutical to look to see if that was involved in addiction or at least an alcohol intake. And we published that in Nature, okay? And then PNAS, Science, a lot of other very high-tier journals. Now, that led to a development in 1981, where I looked at precursor amino acids for serotonin, for endorphins, for dopamine, for glutamate, GABA inhibited so that we don't get that inhibition. And we developed something that I put on the market in 1984. And at that time, it was a nutraceutical. Research name was KB220, okay? We put that on the market in 1984. By 1989, we had 1,000 treatment centers using the product. It was the amino acid, the keflinase inhibition, and it was doing fantastic all around the United States and helping people get off drugs, okay? In treatment centers, residential treatment centers, recovery centers all over. 1989, the FDA took L-tryptophan off the market because it affected 35 people that had eosinophilialia, and it knocked my product out. And the treatment centers stopped using it because they were afraid. Then it came back and they made a mistake, and the reenactment of L-tryptophan came back. The point of the matter was is this, that nutraceutical, which affected thousands of people in the right direction, we reinvented, okay? And we had did a lot of research. There are 35 studies, animals and humans, on KB220Z, and that product, and looking at obesity, looking at heroin addiction, psychostimulants, alcoholism, eating, gambling, a lot of interesting RDS subsets. We show that not only do we state that it balances dopamine in the brain, we have beautiful new imaging studies in animals, in heroin addicts, psychostimulant addicts, in humans as well, that it actually stimulates dopaminergic pathways and brings about, and we have pictures to show that we absolutely have dopamine homeostasis. We balance dopamine in the brain. Too high, we bring it down. Too low, we bring it up. We are suggesting, forget about opioids for opioids, opioids for opioids that they're doing right now, okay? And causing death. Why not use a nutraceutical that has been shown in 35 studies to balance dopamine, reduce craving, increase happiness, and why not use it? So my idea is the following. You do the GARS test, you find out the DNA antecedents that may pre-addict you to becoming high risk for drugs. Then you can customize the nutraceutical and make your own customized KB220 and use that instead of giving opioids, okay? And you can measure whether or not by RNA profiling, whether you change the protein or not. So you got a system, okay? And that system is a reward deficiency solution system. That's what I've been pushing. I think that should have merit. I think it should be seriously looked at. But because it's a nutraceutical, the FDA is not going to look at it. I even went to the FDA some years back. They won't even look at it.
And so is there any of these, amino acid, nutraceuticals, is anything available right now
Yes.
on the market?
Yes, there is.
So that's a tunable. Well, that's great. That's the definition of precision medicine, right? That's what we talk about. Safe precision medicine, by the way. What's different about what's commercially available than what you're talking about, just so for our audience to understand?
So I, at one point, had out in my company the GARS test and the precision customized KB220, okay? And there's been many variations. But COVID got in the way. The company went bankrupt, okay? Not to my doing. And then, but we do have a product that is a one size fits all. It's called Brain Reward. And it's a product that is licensed from my company to Victory Nutrition International, VNI. And that product is out to be obtained. We are now working to develop the GARS test again and to put together something that we now call, is going to be called New Brain X. New Brain X.
Okay.
And NUBRAN, BRAIN-X, New Brain X. And that's something we've been developing for the future. So hopefully this year.
Fantastic. I think there's a couple of things. It's interesting because I see a lot of similarities. And so during my last couple of years where I talk to everybody and anybody about wellness, and I'm really trying to figure out really how to optimize health for the general population. So one of the things you mentioned, you talk about peptides. There's so many different peptide therapies that are out there that are showing so much potential. And it's actually interesting because I just talked to a guy who's a men's health physician, does a lot of, testosterone replacement and those things, but he was much, much more excited about what is happening in the science of peptides, and discussed with me, like specifically some peptides that he was putting his clients on for weight loss with I mean, they were having like incredible results from it. But unfortunately, all of the pharmacies that he was getting the peptides from basically were told, you can't do that, you can't do that anymore. And we all know what, how that all, we know kind of the why. And so he's been really frustrated because he has all these like high level, these clients, these executives from all over the world that he had on these peptides, and now he can't even get them anymore because these pharmacies that were dealing with the peptides were out, and again with minimal side effects. People were doing great. Peptides are pretty big. There's so many. If you go on YouTube and you just put on peptides, people are talking about it, but yet there's so much pushback on peptides. And people have to ask, I mean, I don't want to get into controversial realms, but we have to start asking the question, what are appearing to be fairly safe substances? Why is there such a pushback? And I don't see the FDA lining up behind peptides to approve them, clinically for treatment. It's interesting because it's the same, it's your same story going on, magnified over many other doctors and clinics and this. And I think it's really it's hurting the public not to have access to these technologies.
Absolutely. Let me just point out something though. What people forget is that when they use a singular substance, like in pharmaceutical directed therapy, forever, whatever, okay?
Right.
They're missing the boat. What we do with the nutraceutical is we mimic the way the brain works. We mimic something that I'll talk to you about, the brain reward cascade.
Mm-hmm.
And every substance in the nutraceutical has a role all across the brain reward cascade. Right. And it's not just mimicking one neurotransmitter, it's the whole reward cascade, even to the point of getting dopamine release. And we measure by using this substance, for example, not only stimulation of dopamine pathways, increase of dopamine neuronal recruitment as well. So it's a matter of mimicking the way the brain works in a safe, non-addictive, hardly at all any adverse effect, natural substances that when you bring it together, it brings about dopamine balance and homeostasis. And the whole problem of the opioid crisis, of the drug crisis, of the behavioral addiction crisis is what? Dopamine dysregulation. And we proved it at 88.8 million samples.
I mean, I feel so educated, honestly, on this topic, because it's not an easy topic to read. There's so much on there, but actually, talking to you, I'm very excited about the future of where, as people look at it and start targeting things like nutraceuticals, like this, especially yourself. I think there's just so much potential to make such a difference in people's lives, because addiction, just general addiction, it absolutely destroys lives. It destroys families. It destroys kids. And again, like the way we started, we live in such an addictive environment. We're addicted to everything. We're addicted to social media. We're addicted to watching television. We're addicted to food. We're addicted to drugs. It's just anything, to gambling, sex, everything. And it's yeah, exactly. It all goes to RDS. And I feel like, it's just fascinating, going back to the release of your body's own endorphins. And that's, I mean, again, this is like I feel like I've gone through an entire neurology course in this discussion, but one of the things that we're interested in looking at on the wellness side, because I think photobiomodulation is, I'm fascinated by photobiomodulation. Okay, the two words in our household, like the number one word that I'm not allowed to use, my wife gets upset, is mitochondria, because I'm obsessed with the mitochondrial function. So I'm allowed to use it like once a day, maybe, right? Even though one of my guests said I get a pass. It was a Super Bowl edition with one guy, and he said, "Oh, you can say it twice." But another word is photobiomodulation, and I think that there is the potential on photobiomodulation. It's off the charts, and so one of the things we've started looking at, in addition to the more classic red light therapies, are green light therapy and the ability for green light to release the body's own endorphins. So one of the things I talked about with Dr. Sipple was, because he knows a lot about kind of the nutraceuticals that you've been working on, and has actually talked to me about it. That's the way this kind of came about. And think about if we can release and create some homeostasis potentially just with photobiomodulation, especially in that green light, therapy, some with red light, but some of it green. There's something about the green light, and it's early, right? We're early in the study of green light therapies, but just imagine, combining some of these treatments with the nutraceuticals. Now you're talking about like, no, not like non-medication, non-invasive, nothing, potentially solving so much of what we are, dealing with, these dysfunctions, these addiction dysfunctions and others, because honestly, and getting people off of opioids by natural means. I mean, the potential is so much, but I feel like, we love to say, the wind is at our backs, or wind is at our sails. It's certainly not. I mean, we're all swimming upstream trying to get this message out. Me, it's both looking at it and like clinically, but also just talking about it and bringing guests on like yourself. I feel like we're swimming straight up river with so many forces trying not to get these messages out. And I always talk about it. I had my epiphany a couple of years ago when somebody came to me and said, "Do you know about all these technologies that are out there that can help people?" And I said, "No, never heard of it." And my frustration's been, well, my door is knocked on constantly. I'm constantly being sold something. As a surgeon, I am being just in nonstop. My inbox is full of salespeople. They're trying to sell me everything. You know what? No one tried to sell me photobiomodulation units. Nobody tried to sell me lasers, even though lasers are becoming a lot bigger in the orthopedic community, thanks to like Ortho Laser and some of these other groups that are out there. No one ever tried to say, hey, you know what? For your osteoporosis patients, you really should be using pulsed electromagnetic frequency. It's been studied. Like for your osteopenia, why are you not, no one's saying, hey, you should put everyone through a DEXA scanner to start asking the question, why are 35-year-old women that are sedentary having like the osteopenia, and you're not even thinking about it until they become osteoporotic, when they're 60, and then having all these fragility fractures, which is another disaster, right? And so it is like, what are the forces out there that are blocking some of these things from becoming mainstream? Because you don't hear about this stuff in the mainstream, whether it be in the media or in mainstream medical community. We don't talk about it.
Well, I'll give you a little food for thought as well. Not only is it blocking you to hear about it, when I submit papers to major journals, there are so many people that yell back at me, okay? Say, oh, I'm just looking to make a buck, and this stuff doesn't work. I get pushback from the scientific community as well, which makes it difficult. But
yes,
perseverance, we keep going and going and going. And more people are beginning to understand that this pushback is not smart, okay? And even with photomodulation, which, by the way, after the show, sometime in the future, I'd like to talk to you and Dan, because I got an idea that if we could do photomodulation in the animal, okay? I'm sure Dr. Peter Thanis and I could be interested in doing experiments to not only prove that we could get dopamine release, but we could get dopamine release. And we could do studies to back up the idea was can be very important for addiction. Anyway, so we are living in a time where we need to open our minds. We're looking at a time where opioids to treat opioids causes death prematurely. We're looking at a time where the FDA is making crazy decisions about stuff that is being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry, like GLP-1 agonists. So instead of embracing the concept of bringing balance into the brain of people that have a predisposition for addictive behavior through the DNA antecedents and epigenetic insults, why not embrace it instead of fighting it and causing death and death and death with no solution instead of happiness? To me, that's what we have to do. I have suggested that the GARS test really could be used at birth to just not to label anybody, to find out what the pre-addiction trait is, not state, trait genetically. And then as that person grows, you can start using amino acid therapy to balance them. And we've shown in ADHD, we've shown that it has a powerful effect to increase focus. I showed the electrical activity of how in 30 days by using this, you can increase focus, electric therapy. You can use H-wave technology as a pain replacement for opioids with other things like what you are doing. Why not? I mean, we have now maybe almost 20 papers on H-wave therapy to show reduction of pain medication like opioids. So I'm just saying that all these modalities coupled together could bring about a bionic person to help them get through the fact they are born with their ancestry's genetics and they have survived. But in the survival, we live in a century where we are so addicted to life.
I mean, that's incredible. I love the fact, like the open-mindedness. This is one of the things that, and then I talk about openly at the beginning. We are doing a disservice to millions of people by closing their minds. And as a medical community, we have to stop being so close-minded to the possibilities that things outside of what we're used to thinking about or what's being pushed can create traumatic differences in people's lives and change their lives. So between lifestyle and then and education and then these newer technologies and things like the Neutraceuticals and testing that can actually identify who is at risk for what. This is all we need to be talking about. We have to stop doing the thing. I just did a little piece the other day, which is going to be released on social, but I went on I couldn't help it. I just turned the camera on and I went on a rant. And the rant was the following. The definition of madness is doing and going to the same over and over. We go to the same well, get the same exact result, but yet think that the next time we do it, it's going to work. And that's what I see in my people and my patients. They come back, they've been tapping the traditional system for years. I mean, some of these people have seen so many providers. I don't even know if they have time for any kind of other life other than going to some provider. But yet, despite all that, they still are in the same boat. They're sick. They're metabolically unwell. They're ticking time bombs. They still have hypertension despite being on 3 meds. They're still depressed despite being on 3 meds. And they sometimes are the most resistant to thinking about other supposedly alternative. Again, I don't call it alternative. I just say, no, it's something, it's different, right? It's not, it's just something different that you haven't heard of. and they resist that. And it is a cultural mindset. It is in that mass psychosis kind of environment where we've convinced ourselves that there's only one way. And the way that we're going to change is we need an army. I always talk about this on social media. We need an army of us to band together. People that have, that have had careers and have a voice, band together and say, you know what? Some of the stuff that you are hearing, it's just not true. And here is the truth. We're going to cut to the truth. We're going to tell you what's really going on. And by doing that, and the fact that the population is starting to sniff out over time, something's not right. There's more and more people that are out there. They're like, something is not, I don't know, like it's just like everybody's sick, everybody's unwell, everyone's seeking, everybody's addicted. Something's not right. So between the change in the change in the mindset of the population, but importantly, the change in the leadership, the people that are leaders in our medical industry need to step up and do something. The time for sitting on the sidelines and just being like, well, it's just been like, I'll just do my thing. I'll write some scripts and then I'll go home and I'm going to play a couple rounds of golf this weekend. That can't happen. We have to wake up and help people to heal, get better. And like you said beautifully, happiness. We want people to be happy. And by and large, our society is not a happy society. It's just not.
Not
and we
all.
need to go in that direction.
One of the things that we have to be considerate about is that even though you have an army of medical doctors, nurses, all of that, remember, we have, in terms of mental health, the National Institutes of Mental Health. Now we have the National Institutes of Alcoholism, Alcohol Abuse. We have the National Institute of Drug Abuse. My dear friends, George Koo, director of NIAAA, Noah Vogel, I know very well, who's the director of NIDA. It's a whole long story between Noah and I. In fact, just quickly, when I did the gene work, NIAAA gave her a grant to prove that Ernie Noble and I were wrong with the DRD2A when I left, okay? She called me up in 1991. I didn't even never heard of her. And she said, this is Noah Vogel. I said, okay, who's that? And she was at Brookhaven. And she said, Dr. Blum, I worked and worked for over a year. They got a grant from the NIAAA to prove that you and Ernie Noble was wrong. You're right. And she stuck to that. And her work has all been about dopamine, okay? But when I sat down with her, not too long ago at a neuroscience meeting, she said, Ken, tell me how we're going to raise dopamine levels. I said, you don't want to raise it, you want to balance it. And I wanted her to do an experiment with me. Well, she didn't really do it. But the point is, you have to get people at the top, like NIAAA and NIDA, to come forward and say, look, we got it wrong. We don't want to give alcohol to the alcoholic. We don't want to give opioids to the opiate addict, or methamphetamine or cocaine to the psychostimulant. They want to balance it. They don't want to say it because they don't know how to do it. And even with 35 studies, they still don't want to do it. I don't know. I don't know why. That's my
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I think we've covered just a tremendous amount of information here. Honestly, you're just an inspiration to me, and the fact that you've been doing this for so long have just changed the game in the way that we think about addiction medicine. But yet even somebody with credentials that can be is nothing, you can't say anything other than they're impeccable credentials. I mean, the highest level credentials, even you're getting pushback. So I don't feel as bad that people are pushing back against me and all the wellness stuff and we didn't even talk about microbiome and how that plays into, creating serotonin and doing all that. That's for another discussion. I'd love to have you back on the show in the future, because I think after this, people are going to just be wanting more, and they're going to be like, they're going to be asking questions about, well, when's the targeted nutraceutical coming out? Maybe it can help me, and I'm sure that, and we didn't even talk about it, I'm sure those targeted nutraceuticals can also be used as adjuvant care in neurodegenerative disorders that have all kinds of dysregulation, right? That are going on, but that be for another, discussion.
Okay, I'm gonna say one more thing, and then that's the end.
Okay.
In our PGX study, we show that the opioids also increase cell death, apoptosis, so you age, and increases the chance to getting Alzheimer's.
That's a whole, like I said, that's a whole other topic of discussion. There's so much to talk about. And again, what excites me about doing this show and this program is that the amount of learning, I feel like I'm back at Columbia Medical School, being taught by all these brilliant people. And I do miss that. And so this has been like today, and just generally just doing research on all of these things has energized me in a way. So I think that I want to become as great of a communicator as I can be I even want to be almost like a wellness evangelist, so to speak, in the realm of, I want to be, I don't want people to just think that I'm just trying, again, like you said, I'm not selling anything. But what I want to do is be able to communicate ideas such as that you have to the general population and change their mindset. We need a paradigm shift in the way we're thinking. Our brains are not thinking clearly. I keep talking about it on social. I was the same, 16, first 16 years in practice, I was thinking about the stuff, but for myself. I wasn't thinking about it. How am I going to help the world in the field of wellness? I'm like, how am I going to help myself and my family, which is typical of what we do. We get to a certain status and then we want to try to, live forever and do all the, anti-aging and all this stuff. But then it just hits. I've seen nothing but sick people. I want to help them. And your advice and your amazing knowledge and wisdom allows people to open their minds and start thinking, wait a minute, what is this reward deficiency syndrome? And maybe that's why my brother can't get out of this crazy loop that he's in, because you know what? The people that are working with him, they've never heard of reward deficiency syndrome. So maybe they're not the right people. And maybe we have to think about, other things. What I would also like to pick your brain about in the future on another episode, because we don't have time. I think that spirituality and we talked about happiness, vibration, just the fact that we are, like 99%, 99.9% empty, right? We're just vibration, right? Everything is vibration. And bringing things like yoga and meditation and how those potentially can change the pathways, and even those potentially modify the reward deficiency pathway. And I know that you've touched on some of that stuff, and we'll touch about it on another episode. Maybe we'll call it the happiness episode and try to define what is happiness and how do chemicals define our happiness, and talk about things like belief, like religious beliefs and just meditation practices, yoga, how those things tie into it. So on that note, I just want to thank you so much for being on the show today. I look forward to a lot of collaboration, because I have about 10 ideas that I'd like to work with you on. And so, we'll talk offline afterwards, but, until next time, we'll let you go for now, but I really appreciate it. One final thing, if people want to find you and learn more about you and things, what's the best way to do it? Should they just Google you, or is there like a preferred platform that you'd like them to find you on?
Well, I think the best thing is probably to Google, because right now my website is down. So just Google me, and if they have any real questions, you could give them my email, and I respond to people. It's drd2gene@gmail.com. And Kenneth Blum, and I'm happy to hear from people. It's not a problem. Also, I want to say that I appreciate you, Dan, appreciate the idea of wellness at the speed of light. I think that's a great concept.
Thanks.
And I'm excited about working with you.
Well, thanks. That was great. That was, I mean, that was fantastic.